We're talking about the ongoing crisis in Syria. Joining us here in Washington is Ubay Shabandar. He is a former senior advisor to the Syrian opposition coalition and former U.S. Defense Department analyst. Also with us is Colonel Gary Anderson, a retired 29-year veteran of the U.S. Marines. Colonel Anderson helped train Marine advisors to the Iraqi army and was a civilian advisor in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Colonel Anderson, you have written that the United States, the West, should now rethink its strategy in Syria to include President Bashar al-Assad. Given what's happened in that country, and we've all seen the level of human suffering there, and there have been allegations from the West that Assad has used chemical weapons against his own people, how is that going to work?
Well, quite frankly, I don't think we the United States, should become directly involved in overthrowing Assad. I think the Syrian opposition should do that. We're not very good at regime change. We've got going back to Vietnam, we've got about 100% track record of not doing very well at that sort of thing. And I don't think that's really our job. I personally think that our job should be to eliminate what I guess people call ISIL, ISIS, or the Islamic State, and allow perhaps the Syrian opposition to take over that area that they're controlling. But I don't think that the Syrian opposition is going to be able to eliminate ISIL itself. So
you are saying the U.S. primary focus right now should be Islamic State, not Bashar al-Assad?
That is my opinion. To be honest with you, we've both probably been involved in that area long enough to understand that, at least I understand that, we don't understand what we don't understand. Right. And if we try to get involved in knocking over Assad, I think it's going to be I don't think it's going to be a good outcome. We're just not very good at that sort of thing.
Ubay, what do you make of that?
Well, I mean, I think the ship has already sailed. I mean, we have to remember that the uprising against Bashar al-Assad was an organic, popular uprising by the people that began in 2011. It wasn't instigated by any foreign power, and certainly it was not instigated by the United States or by the West. Now, what happened here after the first year of the revolution, the Assad regime began retaliating en masse, first using live fire, then using artillery strikes, then using mass airstrikes. And when Syria became a national security imperative to the United States is when we started seeing the potential for spillover into the region. So I really think here that you have a true incentive for the United States, not just to become involved, but to actually ensure that Syria doesn't become a failed state. Now, because we've seen what failed states result in. Failed states result in transnational terrorist organizations using that chaos to expand globally.
Yeah, but all those things that you've just talked about, a spillover, a failed state, that failed state being exploited by extremist groups, all that's happening right now in Syria.
All that is happening right now. And we also have to remember that the Assad regime really controls barely 15% of Syria. So working with Assad in any shape, way, or form is simply not going to be effective. And second, we also have to remember that from the perspective of the Syrian opposition and many independent analysts as well, the Assad regime and ISIS are two sides of the same coin. I mean, here we had a regime that was actively allowing foreign fighters from al-Qaeda in Iraq to flow into Iraq from 2006 to 2009, maiming civilians, attacking American personnel, and attacking Iraqi security personnel. So that nature of the regime really hasn't shifted. It's very cynical. It's using ISIS as a pretext to legitimize its very much illegitimate presence. The United States is involved. It's become involved because there's a security imperative in ensuring that Syria doesn't become a failed state, that ISIS can expand its growth. And supporting the opposition, I think, is a key element to defeating ISIS.
Colonel Anderson, sorry, you want to say something?
No, go ahead.
I've read one of your papers, and you've compared the U.S. strategy in Syria to that of the U.S. strategy in Vietnam. And I just want to quote back to you something that you've said here. You said the Obama administration has placed self-imposed limitations on the use of ground forces, thereby creating the kind of sanctuary that North Vietnamese represented from 1963 to 1975. Is this history repeating itself here?
Well, I see some parallels. I was in high school back when we first got involved, And I remember us sending advisors, then maybe doing a little bit of bombing, a little bit of more bombing, and that incremental approach. And I'm really talking about attacking the Islamic State. I kind of separate the two issues, which we probably disagree on. But I think if we're going to take on the Islamic State, we have to understand that we're fighting a regular army. This is a basically they're foreign fighters. They're in Syria. They're from Chechnya and from a lot of places in the Muslim world. And to defeat a regular army, you need basically a regular army to go in and do it. And you can't just do it in Syria. You can't just do it in Iraq, or they will, flow back and forth. So my position is that we probably need to deal with the Islamic State as a problem, but the Assad regime, I think, is a separate issue. That's something I would like to see us arm the guerrillas or the insurgents, the rebels, and help them overcome Assad. But I don't think we should get involved in knocking over Assad. I think we should concentrate on the Islamic State and clear the playing field, so to speak, for the opposition.
Well, you just can't firewall the Assad issue and ISIS and Daesh. And the reason for that is that I believe that you have to also tackle the root causes that allowed ISIS to flourish and to grow in the first place. And that is the Assad regime. It is exactly the type of chaos that the Assad regime's warplanes, dropping barrel bombs, which are 500 to 1,000-pound bombs on apartment buildings, schools, bakeries. It's that type of chaos that's allowed ISIS to thrive. It also builds a sense of hopelessness amongst the populace that that they will always support even extremists if they are protected. So you have to provide an alternative to ISIS, and that's why you need a local partnered force. The United States needs to partner with the moderate Syrian opposition forces that are on the ground that have been fighting ISIS since January 2014. That's the key formula for success.
But isn't the United States view, and I know this is a little bit simplistic, but isn't the U.S. view, the enemy of my enemy is my friend? Therefore, we should be supporting Assad in this. I mean, the United States sees ISIS, Islamic State, as the threat to itself, not Bashar al-Assad.
Well, what's interesting here is that we've heard senior American officials like Secretary John Kerry and even White House officials specifically saying that the Assad regime is the primary magnet for terrorism in the region. Now, we've also seen denials from the White House that there's any strategy by the United States government to work with the Assad regime and to cooperate and to coordinate. That being said, we've also heard from the Department of Defense, the American Department of Defense, that the effort to arm the moderate opposition forces is strictly focused on fighting ISIS and not necessarily the Assad regime, though it's going to be increasingly difficult to compartmentalize the two efforts.
How do you do that on the battlefield?
It's really not going to be operationally viable, because when you talk to rebel forces on the ground, and I've talked to many of them on a regular basis, they will tell you that they view both ISIS and the Assad regime as two flanks in the same campaign, in the same war. They have to defend their homes, they have to defend their villages, and they have ISIS attacking them from one flank and the Assad regime and his Iranian-backed militias from the other. Now, you have American-supported weapons that are already going in to the rebel forces, to the guerrilla forces. That's already happening, but that's part of a separate program than the American Department of Defense effort.
Right. Colonel, does that explain perhaps the reticence on the part of the United States to continue to arm moderate forces or other forces in Syria? Because the fear is that these weapons, these forces, will ultimately turn against U.S. interests in Iraq.
Well, the problem is, we armed the Iraqi army. A lot of those arms now are in the hands of ISIS. I think that the bottom line is we're very reluctant, I think, and rightly so, to make sure that the opposition groups are properly vetted, so we don't end up doing what we did in Afghanistan with the Mujahideen and having a portion of them turn the weapons on us. But we're in violent agreement that I think that we should be supporting the moderate resistance. I just don't think that we personally, that we, the United States, should be in the business of directly trying to overthrow Assad. Personally, I think a soft landing for the Assad regime, some kind of a negotiated settlement under pressure that allowed them to transition to something a little bit more palatable to us and to the opposition would be good. And that's what the opposition started to do. They wanted to try to bring about peaceful regime change.
But at this stage, given that the war's gone on, it's entering its 5th year right now, and as I said, we've already seen all the suffering, the displacement of people, what they've gone through. I mean, Ubay, is there any role for Assad in any future government? Is that any of that going to be palatable to the opposition?
Well, I mean, 50% of the country at this point are either refugees or have been internally displaced. And you have a regime that refuses to stop the bombardment of its own citizens. I mean, in the capital itself, in Damascus, on a daily basis, you can hear outgoing artillery fire and rocket fire into the suburban neighborhoods from the capital, from Assad regime military bases. It's clear that Assad himself and his Iranian advisors believe in a very much a maximalist position, that they can win this militarily, and they can even potentially win this fight by simply exterminating and wiping out whole villages and towns that oppose the Assad regime's rule. So this is a regime that's very much not going to go away quietly, and certainly is not going to go away through a negotiated settlement.
Gentlemen, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks for joining us. And that is all for this edition of The Heat. But